Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and today we're going to take a deeper look at the built-in planning tools of Flight Sim 2024 and learn how to create IFR flight plans with it. I'm not gonna lie, back when it first launched, the default planner was a bit rough around the edges, but it's come a long way since the initial release, and where I think it has its place is for creating flight plans for smaller general aviation planes. It's a good way to learn the nuts and bolts of planning flights, but where I feel its limit is right now is when it comes to business jets and airliners. It doesn't quite have all the tools you need there, and since it doesn't integrate with external applications like Beyond ATC, it can limit your usage of it in that sense too. Let's get right into the flow that I recommend to use with it then, and that starts from the browser-based tool because it allows us to do most of the planning well before we start Flight Sim up. Our first step then is to select a plane, and this is where we run into our first limitation. And you're going to notice that most of the planes have little exclamation marks next to them, meaning that they don't currently have performance or fuel burn data. That can be a problem if you're planning a flight that's near the max takeoff weight of the plane, but for the most part with GA planes, unless you're planning a really long flight, you can get away with just filling the tanks up so that you have plenty to get where you're going. I've picked the TBM here since it's one of my favorite of the default planes, and from there our next step is going to be on the route tab where we're going to spend most of our time setting things up. We'll start by making sure that the flight type is set to IFR, and we're going to leave the cruise altitude and the performance section as it is for now, and we'll look at it a little bit later. We'll go straight to pick our origin and destination instead. And once you click in either field, you can search either by name, or if you know the ICAO code for the airport, you can type that in directly also. The flight that I've got in mind is going to take us from Toronto City Centre Airport out to Thunder Bay. And once I've picked both of them in the dropdown, the map now shows us our route as a straight line from A to B. Now, if we wanted to, we could fly the route this way, but that's not how you typically do an IFR flight, since there are different procedures and restrictions that you need to comply with to get where we're going. Between the origin and the destination, there can be up to 4 additional parts to the route, starting off with the departure procedure, which is effectively a series of waypoints that you follow to take you away from the airport area. There's a departure auto select button that you can press, and it actually works quite well, but we'll go in to pick our departure manually instead, just so that we can have a look at how all of that works. Back when we picked our origin airport, it automatically picked the runway to use for takeoff based on the ATIS report and what the winds are doing, and it looks like it selected runway 8 today, so we need to look into procedures for that runway specifically. Each of the colored segments on the map is a separate procedure that you can pick from the options list, and the main criteria that I use to choose one is to see how it lines up with our direction of flight, but as you can see here, none of them are actually that great for us. One option in that situation is to pick the direct departure, which means you won't fly a departure procedure, and instead you'll go directly to the first waypoint of your route once you're cleared to do that. For our purposes here, though, we'll pick the Perlo 4 since it at least heads westward like we want, and if you look closely at it, you can see it branches out near the end of it into 3 different directions. Each of those branches is what's called a transition, so it's basically the last waypoint along the procedure, and again, you just have to pick the one that lines up the best with your route. I'm going to pick the Durlo transition since it's the northernmost route, and once I select it, it now shows us all of the waypoints of the procedure right up to the Durlo waypoint. That'll bring us to the next and longest part of our route, so the cruise or en route section, but rather than pick those waypoints now, we're going to jump straight to the arrival procedure next, which will make picking the bits in the middle just that little bit easier since we'll know where we need to end up. The arrival procedure is also made up of a series of waypoints that you follow in sequence, and it's pretty common for there to be restrictions either on the altitude or the airspeed at different points along the way. You again pick the one that lines up the best with the direction that you're coming in from, which for our flight here is going to be the Nodder 4, and then from there we'll pick the duple transition since it's a bit closer to our flight path. That's loaded up all of our waypoints for the arrival, but one thing that you might notice is that at Viver, the altitude is shown in purple, which tells you that there's a restriction at that waypoint. A line above the restriction means that you need to be below that altitude as you cross the waypoint. A line below the restriction number means the opposite. And since this one has a line above and below it, it means that you need to be at exactly 5,500 feet as you cross. Once you get to the other end of the arrival procedure, it's going to leave you in a spot that makes it easy to transition onto the last part of your flight, which is the approach to the runway, be it either with a localizer, ILS, or RNAV approach. For runway 25, we've only got the choice between the two RNAV approaches, Yankee and Zulu, and there's actually a big difference between the two that's important to know about. Let's look at the Yankee first, and if we open up the chart, in the top right it says GNSS required, which is our onboard GPS, so that's fine, but right below that it also says RF required. RF approaches are more precise versions of a GPS approach, and the problem is most general aviation planes aren't actually equipped to fly these types of approaches, and it might not even let you select it once you're in the plane either. That means we'll have to use the other approach. So we'll change the procedure out and we'll pick the 25 Zulu instead. And we'll also have to pick a transition for this approach too. For an approach, the transition is often also called an initial approach fix or an IAF, and it's basically the first waypoint of the approach. I'm going to sound like a bit of a broken record here, but again, we have to pick the transition that's closest or makes the most sense with our flight path. And since we're coming in from the south, it looks like that's going to be the ECBL transition. Of course, things can sometimes change between the time you take off and get close to your destination, but for the most part, it tends to work out, especially since the same arrival procedure can often be used to get you to either runway. The last step now then is to decide what to do with the cruise segment and figure out what waypoints and airways it makes sense to add to our flight plan. The map layer that you use for this is going to depend on your cruise altitude. So if you're going above 18,000 feet, you'd use the IFR high layer, but if you're staying below 18,000, then you'd use the IFR low layer. The TBM we're flying today can cruise high and fast, so we'll definitely be on the high altitude airways, but if you were flying something that isn't pressurized, then you definitely want to pick the low altitude airways instead. For us to actually fly on an airway though, it has to be useful for our flight, and the only one that I see that fits that criteria is this one right here, since it runs basically parallel to our route. The easiest way to find the name of the airway is to zoom in on it and then follow it around, and it shouldn't be too long before you run into a label that identifies it. So like for this one, it's the Q917. There are a few different ways to go about adding waypoints and airways to the route, but my preference is to use the route string right here since it's a clear way to write out and understand how the route actually works. Right now, we go from the end of the departure at Durlo directly to the arrival point at Dupol, so it's between these two waypoints that we'll have to insert our extra waypoints and the airway as well. We need to figure out where we're going to jump on the airway first, and the waypoint that I'm thinking of using is Muzzet, and then we'll fly on the airway all the way up to the end of it at the SUVOR, which is right here. So in the route string, what we're going to do is from Durlo, which is the waypoint at the end of our departure procedure, we'll go direct, so DCT, and we're going to go to Muzzet, M-U-S-I-T, and then from there, we're going to fly on the airway that we were saying, so Q917, all the way up to the SUVOR, and that identifier is SSM. Once I save that, the route's going to update itself with the changes that we just put in. And if you look closely, it's actually added a few extra waypoints for us, which are all of the waypoints on the airway up to the SUVOR. Now, from the end of the airway at the VOR, there isn't really anything else useful that runs in the direction that we want. So I think we're just going to go direct from there to our arrival procedure. The thing to remember about the route string is that it's always a pair of two waypoints joined either directly, so with the letters DCT, or via an airway or any other procedure for that matter. For example, our first waypoint is the airport at CYTZ, and we use the departure procedure to get to Durlo. And then from Durlo, we go direct to Muzzet, and then we just continue that same process all the way until we get to the airport on the other end. That's really what makes the route string so simple, but yet so powerful, which is why I like to use it. But if you're struggling with it, you can definitely do all of this via the user interface buttons as well, and just watch as the route string updates itself until you get the hang of it. All right, that's going to do it for our route. And if we look back up at the top, our total route time's been updated for us. So it's going to be just a touch over 2 hours and 546 miles. If we head over to the performance tab now, first off, we can see it's picked a cruise altitude of 28,000 feet for us, which will be fine in the TBM. And if you want to know more about picking cruise altitudes, there'll be a link in the description to help you out. Right below that, we have a few options for the climb, cruise, and descent profiles, but overall, I found that these don't result in a huge difference in terms of fuel consumption. What I tend to do is leave it on the max climb and cruise profiles, which will give you the biggest fuel burn possible and give you a little bit more gas than you probably need. We also won't spend a ton of time on the flight details tab since a lot of it isn't super relevant, but if you're using the default ATC, make sure that you tick the IFR box, and you can also pick your call sign or airline information for it to call you by the right name when you're flying. Over on the fuel tab, we can control a few different things, but the main thing to point out is that the trip fuel was automatically calculated for us since it has performance data for the TBM, along with the reserve fuel as well. You can overwrite any of these values if you want, on top of taking any extra fuel if you want to have a bit more of a cushion. For example, if you think you might have to hold for weather, or there's a good chance of having to go around a couple of times, but generally the defaults are going to be fine. The block fuel is your total trip fuel, and it's the number that you would enter into the plane if it asks you how much fuel is actually on board, like the TBM does during its initialization flow. The zero fuel weight is the weight of the plane without any fuel on board. The takeoff and landing weights are both self-explanatory, and for the most part, you won't need these numbers for most general aviation planes. On the payload tab, you can update how many passengers or cargo you're taking on board, but again, it won't make a huge difference for smaller planes unless you're right near max takeoff weight, which it will warn you about if you go over it. As for the briefing tab, I know it can look confusing at first because it confused the heck out of me for the longest time, but it's really not that bad if you turn the hints on. With that toggled on, when you hover over an element, it'll give you a description of what each field is for, and like that, you can slowly learn to know where to look for different things as you progress through your flight. At the top, you've got a bunch of general information that's mostly useful for airliners, and then that's followed by the fuel, the route details, the flight times, as well as the weights. And all of this information reflects what we entered in the other tabs. It's just formatted a little bit differently. The next interesting thing is the flight log and wind information, which is super useful for tracking your fuel usage and your progress during a flight. And again, I'll leave a link to the video where I explain how to use this in depth. The last thing of note is the knee board, where you'll find all of the charts that are relevant to the flight that we just created, from airport diagrams and all of the procedures that are relevant to what we picked. It makes for a really quick and easy way to access the charts if you leave this open on a tab somewhere while you're flying, but it'll also be available in Sim if you prefer to do it that way. With all of that in place though, you're ready for your flight, and if you learned something useful today, please make sure to like the video and subscribe on your way out.